This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. Walter Kirn is one of our nation's most prescient, most erudite cultural observers and commentators, especially when it comes to matters of media. And we did an interesting thing. We traded movies. I suggested a movie that he hadn't seen, Meet John Doe, from 1941. And then he suggested a movie I hadn't seen, which is called Ace in the Hole, a Kirk Douglas classic from 1951. So over the last day, we traded him. So so you watched mine, I watched yours, Walter. It's nice to have you. Thank you for joining me.
It's great to be here. It's great to be out of this dental hell that I've been. I'm not going to be specific, but if people see me smile more than they're used to, it's because of my wonderful dentist who's dragged me through hell, but given me a wonderful smile. I was going to say, when you watch movies like Meet John Doe, which I had not seen, it's like a Christmas present that I left unwrapped for myself, when I was a kid, I would always refuse to open all the presents under the trees. I'd say, Mom, can we leave one for the afternoon? And this was really a present for the afternoon. Not only did I see our time and, even our last week in this movie, I saw a lot of other movies. It was one of the most seminal, truly seminal scripts. And I'm concentrating on the script because Frank Capra gets a lot of credit for Capra-esque storytelling. But without Robert Riskin, the screenwriter, we wouldn't have these stories. And they're so complex that they really are writerly.
Yeah. So the thing begins with and it starts Barbara Stanwyck and Gary Cooper, and in many ways, and I mentioned this to you, that I thought it was a kind of a prequel to one of your favorite movies from I guess it was the 1970s called Network.
It sets up Network in larger terms because it's a movie about the deforming powers of the media, big politics, the machinery of mass persuasion, and so on, which is true of Network too. Network's a movie, though, about a professional journalist, Peter Finch, Howard Beale, who suddenly starts telling the truth, at least as he sees it. This is a movie about an everyman, or even less than an everyman, a hobo / homeless man, I guess we'd call him nowadays. But he seems to be having too much fun out on the road to be a homeless man, and his conscience is the other hobo that he hangs out with, who at some point just splits and says, you're going straight.
Yeah. And that's played by Walter Brennan, who just does this great cranky performance where he's philosophizing on the freedom that you get from being a hobo, where you don't have any attachments and you don't have any obligations.
And I've known guys like that. I mean, they're not strictly hobos, but they're people, up in Montana who live for the outdoors and so on. And at some point, Brennan just gives up and leaves the movie and says, I've been trying to get you up to the Columbia River for 3 years, and you're obviously not going. You're stuck down here, as a cog in this new populist political machine that a newspaper has ginned up, and he just splits. And I love it.
Well, it begins with a funny moment where it begins quickly, right? So they're taking the old name of the newspaper off, and putting the new fancy name on there. Yeah, we're getting rid of the old world. We're going to the new world. That's right. The appearance. So we've got a private equity situation here, and McKinsey comes in and recommending that a bunch of their top reporters are fired, among whom is
but in fact, I mean, and this is a bit of a flaw with Capra. I'm going to tell you, he doesn't give his villains much depth. Riskin, the screenwriter, was a refugee from Russia, and in some way, early in the century. And in some ways, his capitalists are the capitalists of almost communist propaganda. They wear top hats. They're always at dinner parties. They don't, among each other, they don't even disguise their villainy. I mean, nowadays we have billionaires who pretend to be crusaders and really believe they are saving humanity. In those days, for at least Capra, the billionaire equivalent was somebody who sat around and cackled, while their minority servants poured wine into their glass about how they were going to take over the world. But that allows him a lot of freedom with his heroes because we have total sympathy for them instantly. And it's their internal struggles with their own moral qualms that are the focus of the movie. We don't often have the villain, as in a George Bernard Shaw play, say, making a great argument for themselves, or coming up with a sort of Nietzschean or Randian or Machiavellian argument for why they're necessary.
But the real villain doesn't appear until later. So we've got Barbara Stanwyck's fired, but she fires off one last column and writes a fake protest against the state of the world and signs it John Doe. Its circulation soars. The editor says, "Well, now you can't go. You have to keep producing more columns by this great John Doe." She reveals the fact there isn't a John Doe. She wrote it herself. Now they have to go out and recruit one, where they find the
handsomest homeless person in the history of mankind, Gary Cooper, whose magic as a movie star was that he was perhaps the handsomest man. He was a Montana cowboy. He grew up on a ranch in Montana. His family took him to England for a short time to educate him. It didn't work out. He ended up back in Montana in high school. He wanted to be an artist. He was kind of a real sincere soul who ended up in Hollywood. And because he knew how to ride horses, he was able to participate just for a few bucks in a few silent films where they recognized his charisma. But in any case, yes, you keep trying to tell the story for the audience, and I keep pulling us away.
It's a great. But so now he it's not as if he writes letters. He's just a pure mannequin. He's just a stand-in for Barbara Stanwyck, who's the author who writes all these angry letters, and now there begins to be a movement developing around this sort of angry protest against the state of the world, so now they have to produce a John Doe who wants to appear in public. But then she has a change of heart. She says, maybe protesting and anger is not the way to go. I remember my father so well. He always promoted this idea of just love your neighbor. And to get back to an authentic connection with your community, help people out insofar as they need to. Let's ignore politics. Let's go back and develop a kind of parallel system in our country based on charity and genuine human connection. So that begins his new speech. Which
also in the movie, she has a father who he's not ever brought on screen. He's dead, but he's cited, he's alluded to, and he apparently was like yours. He was a very good man who sort of wanted modest, democratic, loving solidarity between Americans.
And then this turns out to be very compelling, much more so than they expected, much better than anger and protest. And it catches the attention of the real bad guy, who's this mogul, whose name I forget now, but he's now we have to remember
Norton. His name's Norton.
D.B. Norton.
Yeah, he's Citizen Kane. I mean, he's except he doesn't have the personal depth that Charles Foster Kane. He doesn't have a rosebud. He's Kane without rosebud. He loves nothing except money. At one point, he asks early on Stanwyck, "What is your motivation?" Because she gins up the John Doe hoax. And she says money. And he says, well, finally, somebody just admits it.
Finally, somebody just admits it. And so he gives her fur coats and takes good care of her and that sort of thing, but funds the John Doe clubs all over the country. But it turns out, as things emerge, that he's not just a benevolent philanthropist. He has political ambitions,
or even just a greedy newspaper owner.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot he was the owner of the newspaper.
Yes, yeah. It's not private equity, Jeffrey. You're
right.
You're retconning this. It is a good old newspaper mogul who has, it turns out, political ambitions.
I had forgotten that. Okay, so he's the actual new owner of the newspaper. So he's going to use the John Doe movement and the clubs for his political ambitions. And now this is 1941, so we've already by this time as a nation developed a kind of image of what a Euro-fascist quasi dictator, would a quasi-dictator type mogul dictator, would-be dictator is like. So he's got a handsome son. He's got a motorcycle corps that are well trained to run drills.
I love the little anecdotal moment in the movie when they show him watching his motorcycle corps running its drills. Now that I think is, now let's remember 1941 it's released. That means it was made in 1940. That means it was written in 1939, which means it's a product of the Depression, not World War II. There's no consciousness in this movie of World War II as a fact, but there is allegorical reference, obviously, to Hitler, whose rise was already known.
And Mussolini, and you had a Franco thing going, and just a kind of a fascist movement rising everywhere, which in this film was sort of contrasted with the earnest democracy of represented by the John Doe Club. But John Doe begins to believe his own scripts and believes he is John Doe. But he's scandalized when he finds out that D.B. Norton wants to use the John Doe clubs for political purposes. And he says, the John Doe clubs will not be used for politics. That's not the point. The point is human connection, not political manipulation. And decides he's going to tell this big crowd gathered in somewhere at a huge stadium, right?
I mean, I don't know if it's supposed to be Madison Square Garden, it might as well be. And let's remember, the John Doe clubs represent the forgotten man, but they're being used secretly by this, let's say, call him a billionaire, this billionaire to advance his own political career. So in some ways, those who don't like Donald Trump would say this is exactly what Trump is, somebody who has fostered a populist movement, a movement of, the forgotten and the deplorable to advance his own, greedy traditional ambitions. But as you say, it doesn't go very far, because Gary Cooper, when asked to commit this cynical act of, turning over the movement that was inspired by, and he knows it's not even inspired by him. See, Cooper, that's the interesting. He starts to think he's John Doe. He starts to play him. We're led to believe he does it in order to please the Barbara Stanwyck to some extent. He says, well, she's in love
with whom he's in love. He's in
with
love
the
with
person
her.
I'm pretending to be.
Yeah.
And who else but Gary Cooper, I think, could be, how can I put it, so appealing, such that he would cause a whole movement and yet pretend to be unaware of whatever charm he's projected. No, Walter Brennan could not have led the John Doe movement. None of the people who play the John Doe followers could have led the John Doe movement.
Those are some sweethearts in the John Doe, and Capra picks out just a handful of them to make a sort of the archetypes of the everyday man, right? So you've got the soda jerk, which I think back in the day was somebody who would serve soda at an ice cream store, right?
Right.
But it's interesting because the guy looks to be in like his 30s or something, but he's happily married, so he's able to support a family, as a guy, working at a drugstore serving sodas.
Yeah, you guys have no idea. You're gonna be driving Ubers and doing DoorDash someday, and you think you need a movement now. You secure family men, soda jerks of America who think you're downtrodden. Wait until you're waiting in a Chinese restaurant on a motorcycle.
You notice too that he's always wearing his funny little soda jerk hat, even when he's not on the job. So it's like he inhabited the role, just completely.
Well, so one other touch here is that it's the soda jerk. Okay, Capra movies are all about stirring speeches from people who you didn't think were eloquent, and suddenly, because of the pressures of the occasion, rise to eloquence. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington being a great example. But in this movie, Gary Cooper, who's been pretty ambivalent about the compromises that involved in pretending to be John Doe, pretending to have written these letters, is really about to abandon the whole thing. I mean, he hobo life is calling. He doesn't enjoy fakery, but this soda jerk gets up and says, the John Doe speech that you gave almost under duress has changed the complexion of my entire neighborhood. The cranky hermit type came out of his house. Everybody decided to go check on the person who is starving alone in another house. And so Cooper has to answer now to the sort of higher calling that he has apparently serving, even though he's personally cheating. And in that, we see American politics in a nutshell, really. I mean, we ask ourselves constantly, how do these actors, because it's my ongoing assertion that most national American politicians are truly actors. I mean, in the lowest sense, not in the Gary Cooper sense, but in the sense of just fraudulent mannequins being fed lines. We wonder how they justify it to themselves. Mm-hmm. And the best case for them is that they believe they're serving a higher cause with their, mannequin-like rehearsal of other people's lines. And I suppose somebody like Graham Platner, who's been in the news recently, if you are to believe his version of himself, which he just presented the other day in a very pathetic way as he left the race, he's just an ordinary guy called by a movement, by a sort of moral trumpet in his ear, and he's just too normal in a way, he claims, too full of all too human drives and so on, and the movement itself is all too subversive for it to exist. I mean, in other words, Graham Platner just pretended he was Gary Cooper in this movie,
and he was selected by these. I saw an interview with, I guess it's famous now, but the Wall Street Journal interviewed the consultants who found him, and they literally went through the roles of donors to the Democratic Party. Found this oyster farmer, and said,
who went to Hotchkiss,
Hotchkiss, yeah,
the premier supply line to the deep state, to the deepest part of the deep state. From our prep school culture.
Yeah. So they pick him and tell him, well, now you're going to be our working class hero. And he says, well, it's not really, are you sure this? It's almost exactly like I get this image almost exactly like Barbara Stanwyck, interviewing people for John Doe, right?
Right.
And they said, no, you're the guy you're going to make possible this national movement. And he says, well, I got a lot of skeletons in my closet. I mean, I've got some weird stuff going on in my life. Don't worry about it.
You know what they really thought when he said that, if he did? That's great. We love guys like you because we can pull those skeletons out at any time if you aren't doing too well in the polls. You know, it's funny. I promise to be always the guy on this show who goes so far afield you don't think you think he's lost the thread. But in the world of UFO whistleblowers and so on, they often in the secret world of sort of high tech military defense, they often let someone tell a little bit of the truth who also has a lot of drunk driving episodes in their past. And so when they decide for whatever reason, they've got to let a little air out of the secrecy. They've got to have some candor. They let someone do it who they can then rug pull later. And that, strangely, is a way of hiding the truth, because if someone has spoken something and then turns out to be unreliable, we don't believe anything they've said. And so, in a strange way, Platner, I think, by being disposable, by being somebody who they can sort of push button into the dunk tank and did throw in the dunk tank, watch the next person be even more radical or something. You know what I mean? Or he takes. For the Republicans, it's there's now a Democratic conspiracy theory that Graham Platner was a Republican plot, that they used somebody who in some way could then discredit their movement. But in any case, I don't know.
Looking for this working class hero, it's getting kind of pathetic, because
who went to Hotchkiss. Yeah.
I
mean, it's literally the opposite of Meet John Doe. Instead of going out and finding a
That's
bum,
right.
kind of, they go out and find a Hotchkiss grad who can play a bum.
Yeah, that's right. And in a similar way with John Doe, they always had something that they could use against him, right? So D.B. Norton is using John Doe,
right?
But the minute that John Doe decides, look, he starts to believe his own rhetoric and think that it really is an authentic grassroots movement. And he's going to expose D.B. Norton. Okay, D.B. Norton runs on stage and stops the rally and says, look, you're a fake, John Doe. Admit it. You were paid to say all those, write all those. You didn't even write those speeches.
But he does that under pressure, because John Doe is about to get up and give a speech saying, hey, this whole John Doe movement was a stratagem for this rich guy to run for president. And to prevent him from doing that, the real operator, the real fake, calls him a fake for having volunteered to pretend to inhabit this character. And then the mob turns against
him just as with just as much energy as they had previously, come great distances and stood out in the rain to hear him speak. But then I guess the conventional movies of that time, it has a kind of a happy, if harrowing, ending. Well, we should recall that the initial promise of the very first John Doe protest letter was that he was going to jump off.
He was going to jump off the newspaper building or something, or City Hall, maybe it was.
City Hall at midnight on
Christmas.
On Christmas, that's it.
Yes.
And so John Doe, now dejected, disgraced, having had fruit and tomatoes. Why does everybody always have a tomato, at the rallies? But anyway, he's being hit by all their food and denounced by the very people who used to just minutes earlier had celebrated him as the great hero of the time. Decides, well, I'm going to prove just how authentic this is. I'm going to jump off this building, and so some weeks, I think, probably go by here, and he finally just takes the elevator straight up, or takes the stairs, I guess, to the top of the building and prepares to jump. Meanwhile, some of the leaders of the movement were hanging out just on the speculative presumption that maybe John Doe was the real thing, and he will try to jump, and they're going to save him. And then,
well, they don't want him to jump because John Doe
Yeah.
is in possession of a letter in which he kind of tells the truth about the whole affair. And right before he's going to jump, he tucks it into his vest or inside his coat. And so what he's hoping to do is kill himself, martyr himself. And then, you know, in a way to make up for his sins as having misled people in a superficial way. But he's going to revive the movement, he believes, with his martyrdom. You know, in other words, he's going to be a voluntary savior figure. I mean, he's not going to be nailed to the cross by the authorities. He's going to volunteer his he's going to volunteer his death. And the last thing Norton, Simon Legree wants is for this John Doe movement, a real John Doe movement, not an astroturf movement that he leads, to take off, because they might, shear the newspaper moguls of their money and so on, and knock off their top hats.
Right. And so he tells him, listen, there's no point in jumping because I've got my people down there. They're going to pull that letter out of your coat when you jump. And he says, well, look, I've already mailed one to
the police have agreed not even to share your identity. People won't even know that you did this.
Yeah. But then Barbara Stanwyck herself rallies. She's got a flu, but she comes up and she gives a very, very beautiful, compelling performance. Oh my Lord, I think it's so powerful right there. She stops him before he jumps and says, "Don't do it, John. Don't do it, John.
I love you."
I love you. So wow, that's something he wanted to hear. So
and he's believed himself all through the movie to be unworthy of her love. He's one of the flaws. Great movies have great flaws. They're hypnotic, and total effect is what's important. But once you pull them apart, they're sort of like human beings. You go, he's got a rotten molar and a bad heart and everything. He was a handsome devil, but look what a wreck he was inside. Well, the scripts can be like that. How John Doe doesn't see what a cunning little, greedy woman she is not to his credit. You know what I mean? And early on in the movie, when he's hungry, when they try to cast him for the role, we see a weird subjective shot of him looking at a ham sandwich on a table, as though all he wants is just to get that ham sandwich. He needs enough money for it, and that's why he goes into this whole scheme. He's sort of that way with Barbara Stanwyck. He just sees the ham sandwich. He doesn't see that she's really a master manipulator and an ambitious person. She stops being that halfway through the movie, unlike the movie Network, which is basically a bitter and more consistent version of this film. There's no redemption in Network. Faye Dunaway stays the evil corporate tool. Ned Beatty, who stands in for Norton, gives almost a rousing speech about the world being basically a capitalist enterprise that has no borders and no real moral concerns whatsoever. And it's so almost convincing that, in the movie, that it almost convinces the anti-hero Howard Beale. But in any case, so she comes in and throws herself on him. And frankly, there's part of me that wanted him to say, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Yeah.
Because you wanted to say, like, oh, we've been following this quandary and this innocent, the sort of Dostoevskian innocent, Gary Cooper, who has allowed himself to sort of betray his simple common Christian morality, and now he's seen the damage that can do, and he's seen through the exploitation that this is involved, and he's going to throw himself over. Oh, and then some pretty girl comes along, and he has second thoughts.
Yeah, he's definitely nuts for her love is blind, as they say. But she's vulnerable, though, Walter.
Right.
She's not that fur wearing sort of gold digger, ambitious gold digger anymore. So because she's got an infectious disease, so she's a little out of sorts, and she's having to work even to give her beautiful speech about which is this, and by the way, a very touching moment, right, when she says, "There's already been one John Doe who gave himself up for all the John Does
2,000 years ago.
2,000 years ago." And at that moment, it's like, whoa, okay,
and it's Christmas.
We're going, and it's Christmas. We're going there. We're going there. Okay.
It goes there so hard that I had to admire it. I mean, she basically says there's no need to martyr ourselves as individuals because a God martyred himself, basically, and did it for all of us. Yeah. And that spirit lives on. And it's a interesting theological argument that you don't have the right, in a way, to make your own sacrifice stand before the Christian sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Savior. So there it's in Gary Cooper's favor. He didn't just do it for a dame. He didn't just back off the precipice for a dame. He did hear and was convinced by the argument that it's almost selfish for us to throw ourselves away when the real sacrifice has already been made. And what would be far more sincere is to fight a losing battle, even if it's a losing battle. And then the John Doe people come up the stairs, some remnant of the John Doe movement. And see, this is also another Capra-esque Deus Ex Machina. We're always told that Deus Ex Machina, a sudden intrusion by another force into the ending of a movie that makes everything okay. We're told that that's a flaw in movies or in drama, but it actually isn't a flaw. It means that you've made your conflict so perfect that only a new term from outside the equation can reconcile things. And suddenly we hear, the John Doe movement that had disintegrated into tomato throwing and chasing and wanting to kill Gary Cooper actually revived itself somewhere off screen in the last few weeks. And a bunch of the more sincere true believers are going to regenerate the whole thing. But
we just lost our heads. We're going to start up our clubs all over again.
We acted like a mob, they confess. Have you ever heard a mob do confession? That's the one thing that mobs don't do. They don't all get back together again and say we were wrong in a mob-like way. So once again, Capra squares the circle, or Riskin squares the circle by having an absolutely outrageously unlikely moment at the end where the mob apologizes to the individual.
Yes. Yeah, amidst a profound sort of theological argument or a point, which is something that you're not prepared for in any way. And so he sweeps the very sick, sort of flu-afflicted, but still gorgeous Barbara Stanwyck up into his arms and carries her.
Picks her up, Fay Ray, like he looks everything like King Kong at that moment. He picks her up. The invasion of what was the creature from the Black Lagoon. Yeah. He sort of has her prone and submissive and carries her away.
Yeah. So that's the sudden and dramatic end. But we're invited to believe that the John Doe movement still has hope, and that she is redeemed. By her religious sort of speech, her edifying talk, and who knows? Then they become a couple. We don't know. But everything's off screen. But I don't know. Enormously satisfying film at
I cried. This is my excuse for these glazed eyes, Jeffrey, because
Wow.
I've saved watching the very ending till 10 minutes before this broadcast. Because one thing I like to do when I watch movies is stop them and guess at what's coming next, because I'm a screenwriter, and see how well I did it. And I got to a certain point in this movie where I said, I don't know how he's going to end this thing. There's an irreconcilable problem here. He has raised a question to which I don't think society or civilization has an answer, which is, how can you both be good and powerful? How can American innocence translate into American political power? Americans want their innocence, but they want power too. We want our goodness, but we want our wealth. We want what tragedians have told us are irreconcilable goods, and he had posed the question so perfectly that I almost thought Gary Cooper. I knew he wasn't going to commit suicide. I knew that's not how Hollywood movies end, but I kept thinking, what if he did? What if he did, and all the mob stood around and looked at the crushed body of Gary Cooper and said, we weren't worthy. Let's carry on. Yeah,
in 1941, they could not have been. They were under the Hays Code at that time, right? So there's an element of that. You had to kind of weave around the mandate for a sort of an ending that was consistent with justice and the American way.
Right. Well, and there's the American way, speaking of which, it gets a cameo in about 2/3 of the way through the movie. The sort of hardened newspaper editor who has been taking orders from the capitalist kind of takes Gary Cooper aside and drunkenly confesses that though he looks hard on the outside, he does have one weakness. And he makes Gary Cooper guess, or gives him some time to be in suspense, and then says, the Star-Spangled Banner. Every time I hear the Star-Spangled Banner play, I get, he said, I feel it in my gut or something. And Gary Cooper says, I feel it on the back of my neck. And this is the moment where we know that they knew war was coming. It's a overtly, nakedly, and kind of jingoistically patriotic moment, and the Star-Spangled Banner.
But it's beautiful, and it's like, we don't want a fifth column in this country. That's what he says. We don't want a fifth column in this country. We want sincere, freedom-loving, patriotic people who are not up to no good. And unfortunately, the guy who's funding your movement is a bad guy. Have you read that speech you're about to give? No, I never read them before I give them. Well,
he says something like, that makes it more fun. And and going back to American politics, I remember at the RFK confirmation hearings, and I was sitting there very near RFK, thanks to his family, so I could see from his perspective what these senators in this horseshoe were like. And when I saw people like Bernie Sanders being delivered their lines by their aides, I know before they had any idea what they were saying, while they put up, pictures of suspect onesies that RFK had supposedly, assented to, I thought, it doesn't help to know your lines in advance when you're Bernie Sanders or Liz Warren or all of the other demagogues I saw up there. It makes it more fun and easier to believe if you haven't had time with the bullshit first.
Yeah, you don't want to seem over rehearsed. I understand that. Yeah. I will say about Walter, and I want to get to Ace in the Hole, but I just quickly want to tell you something that happened last night that really weirdly touched me. My own love with Elizabeth Park right here in West Hartford. Well, I was at a concert last night where they have a band playing American music, which turns out to be sort of pop music from the 80s.
Right.
That's the universal, make everybody happy music. And it was great. And she's a great, but then they shut off the band at like 2/3 the way through the thing. And she began saying, "Oh, say can you," and with no band, just alone as a singer. And everybody's, now this is a very blue, town, where it's and we just got through the 4th of July where
Yes.
Where there was a kind of weird sensibility in the air that if you celebrate Independence Day, you might like Trump, and that would be very bad. So probably you should just stay home and stay safe and keep out of
You
the
might
rain.
like slavery. Frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you celebrated Independence Day this year, according to Mom Donnie, you were all for like sinking boats of immigrants and slavery and every other bad thing.
It was crazy. It was crazy to the point that the blue towns were ghost towns. For the whole of Independence Day. Very depressing. But anyway, I was very pleased when she began to sing that Star-Spangled Banner. Everybody, this is at a park. People are sitting down on their blankets and their little chairs and whatever. Everybody stood. People took off their hats and put their hands on their hearts and listened to her sing and cheered her afterwards. So that was kind of like a moving moment for me in a way. I thought, well, look, even these communists, can feel something from this song. I don't know.
Well, nice. I want to. I want to authorize a real digression here because you brought up something that I think just happened, which isn't properly appreciated and hasn't been digested yet. The 4th of July and the 250th anniversary of the United States was made controversial. Yeah. Now, in traditional American politics, everybody's a patriot on the 4th of July, and then they go back to fighting. This year, they fought right on through it. And they, not just any 4th of July, but the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I think that it was a watershed moment because it forced people into camps over something that they had never had to defend before. No one had ever had to feel just guilty for fireworks or singing the Star-Spangled Banner or whatever. Not at the levels they were asked to this time. And it was a gut check moment. There were, as you pointed out on Twitter, many cancellations of festivities across the country that looked suspiciously like political cancellations in the name of bad weather or too much heat or something.
Yeah, rain, heat, too dry, something. There was always something.
And so I think the 4th of July this year, in a way that probably hasn't been felt by ordinary citizens since the maybe 1960s, was a moment when people saw that the republic might be temporary. That oh my gosh, on the one side, on the side of those who want it to be temporary, it was a moment of almost savage glee. But for the middle, it was a moment when they said, you know what? Which side am I on? I never had to think about this, but this thing may be coming to an end. And that's not what you're used to on the 4th of July. You're used to an overwhelmingly dramatized, theatrical sense of American triumphalism. But this year it looked fragile. And because it looked fragile, it became very valuable to those who don't want it to end.
Yeah. It didn't feel like a typical birthday after which you wake up and life goes on as normal. This seemed to be the beginning of something. The Independence Day this year seemed like the beginning of something important, like a renaissance, like a renewal, like a restoration, a recapturing of forgotten ideals. At least that's my white pill take on it.
I have the same white pill take on it. It felt as though for once, those who take the United States and its constitution and its way of life and its culture and so on for granted. For once, they were presented with the notion that, hey, if they can try to ruin fireworks, if they can try to ruin speeches on the mall, if they can try to ruin all this, they can ruin the whole damn thing. And they're precious close to succeeding. And we're watching various communities in which they are succeeding.
Yep.
And gut check is the vulgar word for it. But I think it was a moment of conscience searching for a lot of people. And they said, am I contributing to its durability or to its temporality?
Yeah,
its demise.
10 states didn't show up to the Great American State Fair, which was a little bit shocking. Just to add to more evidence of this sort of fracturing, very scary, very dangerous.
At the same time, I'm staying right now in Las Vegas. Las Vegas is, unbeknownst to most people, an immigrant city, a city of immigrants. It's one of the only cities in the United States where you can come in, not speak English particularly well, be new to the country and its culture, and still get a good job. In a casino, valet parking, whatever. And it is a city that was not bitter about the 4th of July. And I don't think Mamdani's appointing himself the spokesman for the immigrants of the United States was a great move, because in my read of things, and I go to a gym that's full of new Americans, and it's a huge gym. There are a lot of them there. They want things to work out. They want things to work out for themselves. They want them to work out for their children. And I saw on the 4th of July the use of immigrants and immigration as a inherently anti-capitalist, anti-American wedge politically. I think it was a real overplaying of their
anti-patriotism, right? That was pathetic. Actually, that Mamdani press conference, or whatever that thing was so creepy. It looked like a great advertisement for everything we don't want to be and do in this country. So,
and to bring it back to Capra, it was anti-Capra-esque. What Capra does is he says, despite all your flaws, despite the tragic complexity of the human being, despite our greed and our lust and so on, we can't live without our illusions. And they don't have to be illusions. They can be ideals, and they're usually represented by little innocent kids and, working class guys who work at a soda fountain and so on. And they really are, for a while, treated sentimentally. But in the end, Capra says, your sentimentality about the right things is all you've got. And tend it well and try to be true to it, even though, you have the same corrupt tendencies as everyone else. That is the opposite of the new Mamdani message, which is that you're all faking it. Underneath it is just a history of absolute grotesque exploitation. You're not wanted. The country pretends to maybe before certain constitutional principles of equality under the law, but really it hates everybody who isn't white or whatever, male. And I don't think America can stray that far from Capra and remain America. I think there will be revulsion.
Yeah. I think you just gave a great pitch for this film. The film that I watched this morning before this podcast was from 1951. So World War II happens. It ends. A lot of national suffering following, the Great War, the Great Depression. Now we've got the Second World War. a lot of social dislocation, economic disruption, demographic confusion, communities lost, trying to find their way. And we have this new genre of film which is called film noir,
Right.
which what does that mean? It's like dark movies, but featuring a lot of crime, sort of mafia stuff going on, a lot of deep cynicism and darkness. It's the whole genre, which I love, but
I
wow,
love film noir, and Jeffrey, just as clickbait here, I was very good friends with, and will always love, the great American noir writer James Ellroy. He wrote the novel that was made into L.A. Confidential. And he's one of the greatest noir fans ever. And I said to him one night, James didn't use a computer. He didn't use a cell phone, but his weekly ritual was to go to a film noir every Friday night. And I said, what's the message of film noir? What is film noir? He said, well, film noir aesthetically is a mating of German expressionism, meaning strong, contrasting, emotional lighting and acting and design, with deep pessimism about human nature.
Yeah.
And he said, the message of film noir is, you're fucked. And and it really holds up. And it holds up in the case of Ace in the Hole, which is the most unrelentingly cynical movie.
It's dark. I felt bad for Kirk Douglas playing that role because, boy, is he a bad guy. This is 1951 now. And, our mythical understanding of this period in history growing out of television is that it's just a bunch of, it's a happy land, it's happy days and
Eisenhower.
But actually watch this film, you just can't even believe it. So Kirk Douglas plays, and he's got that sort of famous cleft chin, which in this film, you can't stop looking at it for maybe that's true in all Kirk Douglas movies. I don't know, but it's especially pronounced in this one because of the black and white and the shadows and everything. Oh, what a chin. But he's a failed newspaper man who keeps bumping from job to job because he screws up, with liquor and other personal romantic entanglements, and he's just screwed up. So he lands up in a sort of a rotten job in the desert Southwest, and I believe it's in Albuquerque, but he's dragged his sort of big city darkness with him, and his belief that newspapers can never really be profitable unless they're exploiting some terrible human tragedy, which they are dragging out for as long as possible. And that's the source of profits for newspapers. And he's out on a job to go look at a rattlesnake hunt of some sort, which sounds interesting to me. But along the way, he gets word of a guy who was trying to grave rob some old Indian burial grounds for pots to resell it in his store. And he's got a kind of a quasi sexy wife who has higher ambitions than to just be at this convenience store and being married to this putz. And so anyway, the guy is trapped in the mountain, and so Kirk Douglas smells money and thinks, all right, here we go. This is my story. But in talking to the engineers about how they're going to get him out, he decides that he wants to prolong the pain as long as possible. So he figures the guy can last down there a week. Whereas if they go in the front way and just reinforce some of the beams and the tunnels and things, so they can get him out in a day or two, but you can't make money like that. You've got to prolong it. So they prolong it for a full week with a fake excuse that they have to go in from the top with a drill hammer, like they're drilling for oil. But during this, as the thing unfolds, it starts off with of course, a big story, and then people, gawkers coming by and driving up, and then they're valorizing the reporter. He enters into a corrupt relationship with the sheriff, whom he promises to get reelected. He's in a corrupt relationship with the engineers who are digging the tunnel, who are being well paid for their efforts, and the thing grows and grows, and pretty soon. And the femme fatale now is suddenly got a booming business, so she's rich, and then arrives the carnival, right? So now you have the county fair people coming in with their Ferris wheels, and so the whole thing becomes absurd. Thousands of people, with musicians singing a song about the guy trapped in the mountain,
right?
With the carnival going on. The whole thing is so outrageous, but they're selling newspapers as never before, and he decides to trade up his reporter position from a podunk place in Albuquerque and sells his services to the New York Times. That's how dark. So meanwhile, Kirk Douglas in this entire film just goes from bad to worse to thoroughly evil and just the most rotten human being you've ever observed in your life.
And as allegory, it's a very pure one, because the man who's actually trapped in the cave, who Kirk Douglas goes down occasionally and talks to, giving him hope that, it's just going to be a little bit longer and hang on and so on. That guy represents the truth. There should be a little sign over his face, the truth. The truth is trapped in a mountain. They leak it out as they see fit. They conceal it as they see fit, but not telling it is more valuable than telling it, because once you tell the truth, everything is over. And journalists realize that. In a strange way, the true story of any event is the end of the event. How long have we spent with them dragging out the COVID truth? It's like the man trapped in the cave. I mean, there is truth. It's there. People know how it started. People know where it came from. But the media, which profited off pretending that it started in some other way, then made it mysterious. And now they're profiting off of slow leaks about its actual origins. But it's like the man trapped in the cave. Just show us. Just bring him out. Just bring the truth out. But then the circus ends.
Then the circus ends, and I don't know. I guess there's not a problem in revealing the ending, but consistent with the ethos of the time, it has to end up with justice being served, right? So, tragically, the guy dies. They bring in a priest, give him last rites, and the guy dies. And then, am I right in thinking that the Kirk Douglas gets pangs of conscience at that point? It begins to think of himself as
the problem with the trading movies trick, Jeffrey, was that I haven't seen Ace in the Hole for so long, and you just saw Meet John Doe. So I don't remember exactly what sop to morality or justice, if any, they deliver at the end.
It's very brief. The guy, Kirk Douglas, dies. He falls over dead from drinking too much or something, and there's your justice. But the guy in the mountain is dead, and his wife is kind of glad about it, So yeah, pretty dark and horrifying commentary on mass media, made in 1951. I mean, what
when mass media was truly becoming mass media. In other words, we had the radio and newspaper empires, and they got us through World War II. But 1950 represents the beginning of the TV age, and that was foreseeable. It was starting in small ways, and I think in some ways the movie is prophetic of a. You thought it couldn't get more cynical. You thought it couldn't get more circus-like, more commercial. Oh, you just watch. And Kirk Douglas, as someone who goes more and more corrupt, is spellbinding. Because in some ways we expect from Hollywood to be relieved of this much earlier than we are in this movie.
It's terrifying to watch his decline into just sure evil. Then of course there's that frightening scene where he slaps the guy's wife on the face,
Right.
And you just get the chills. But what a film from 1951 to anticipate.
It was like
so
the Biden
much.
presidency too. It was like, people going into Biden saying, "No, you're really president. Don't worry. Everything is going to work out." But the notion that cynicism for Americans used to be a bracing form of mass entertainment in which we examined our society, examined our souls, had our consciences pricked. In some ways, we're shown the charisma of evil and the difficulty of good, maybe even its impossibility, and that we went to the movies and saw that on the big screen with some of the most attractive faces and figures ever shown to mankind, really shows us how much we've changed. We are so ill-equipped to deal with reality anymore because we don't make movies like this anymore.
No, nothing like that. We have to remind ourselves, this was 75 years ago. This film was on the big screen, and people were paying money to go see it. It's like what a bracing commentary on public life at a time where everybody's trying to figure out, okay, what is the future of America? Are we gonna have another war? What's the deal with this new Soviet problem? What is the role of this new technologies? This box that's coming into my home, showing me things I've never seen before. What is this? What is this country? What is this culture? And to have such a brutal commentary about mass media.
But nowadays, Jeffrey, we are literally expected to think that Jake Tapper is a smart, honest person. We're supposed to think that, the New York Times or MS Now or whatever it's calling itself these days actually are full of people who just want the best for us. If we had gone into COVID with some of the cynicism that was just old hat for Americans watching these movies, we would have done a lot better. But we were softened up for years with a kind of hero worship for these establishment types, and it was really necessary to reinstall what 50 years of movie making and literature had degraded in America, which was cynicism about the media, cynicism about the intelligence, the IC as they renamed it once we were supposed to be all, worshipful toward it. And before COVID, there were years of the press lauding itself as this embattled group of, high integrity people, being persecuted by Trump and so on. So they reclaimed all the cynicism that all those movies candidly explored and in some ways aggravated, so that they could run one more big con on us. And anybody who'd seen Ace in the Hole and really absorbed this lesson would have known the COVID thing from the get-go.
I had not thought of that analogy, but that is just perfect, because so much of the truth is this is the thing that drove me crazy, Walter, and about that whole period, is that in February of 2020, the mainstream press was saying all the things you needed to know in order not to panic, in order to just go see your doctor if you got sick, and right, go ahead and live your life. We had mainstream reports in Psychology Today and all the major medical stuff. Even the New York Times was running rational things in February. Yeah. And then just on a dime, it all flipped, and our knowledge was just wiped out, as if we didn't know anything about the demographics of medical risk, anything about anything, and we're all just floundering around. We have to rely on news media and Andrew Cuomo to give us our interpretive lens through which to understand this great calamity, which they prolonged and prolonged and prolonged for years, and then just sort of faded out. Then the music just faded out, and now we have to just pretend like this never happened.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, that's what's happened now. One thing, as a sort of a historian of American satire, or an amateur historian, is that a lot of groups have been scourged over the years in Hollywood and literature. The press, certainly. We knew they were all scoundrels. I don't know how we went back to thinking they were wonderful people, but somehow they convinced us. We knew that spies and insiders and bureaucrats were liars and self-dealing, robots, but we somehow forgot that. We knew that anyone in the media or entertainment was probably an empty airhead faking it. But somehow we forgot all that. And at the beginning of COVID, movie star testimonials from actors about being sick were what pushed us over the line. I mean, wait. I mean, America, you are too innocent to live when all of Hollywood's top line actors get sick the same week and do like frightened periscopes from their bathtubs, or, Tom Hanks from Australia in his quarantine. Like, the restoration of American innocence was a big project on which they depended to launch the COVID thing. Now, and now they want us to forget, as we started to see through it all, as we started to come back to our senses, as the America that made Ace in the Hole and even Meet John Doe started to remember, wait, let's not trust these people. Wait, we just had a con. Oh, move us along. Now amnesia time. What does Grok say about it? Sometimes I just plead for America, to become at least as suspicious as our grandfathers were, at least as cynical as our satirists were. It's our only defense. I mean, not even Frank Capra, who's known for he's not naive, but in the popular imagination, he's thought to be naive. He tested all his propositions very thoroughly. But like this naivete and this culture that no longer asks questions and no longer knows who the bums are is something we can't afford. I mean, we just can't afford it. We're falling for demagogues that the average housewife in 1941 could see coming a mile away.
Yeah, Platner was only the beginning. There's going to be a long parade of these people, I'm afraid.
Well, the thing about the Platner controversy is that there are so many layers of deception around it that we'll probably never get to the bottom of it. Maybe the guy believes himself just to be, a drunken a veteran who had some fun, and all these ladies who were participating in the fun now have turned on me, and I can't believe it. In other words, maybe they did pick the right guy because he believed his own BS. But I'm starting to think that the disingenuousness of every level of society, from the press to the political machinery, has left us baffled as to which form of con we're seeing. We know we're seeing con games, but they're at so many levels, and because there's no one to arbitrate them. In Capra movies, somebody can finally arbitrate the con. It's not bottomless. somebody comes up and says, I saw the letter, or I know you're faking it, or someone has a crisis of conscience and admits it. But we don't have those Capra-esque moments anymore where, suddenly everybody in a breathtaking way realizes they've been defrauded. It's almost as though we don't want to know. We would feel so implicated and so foolish for having gone along with some of the things we did. We've gone along with that. We don't want that moment of truth any longer.
Isn't it so strange, Walter? I'm not sure what you thought about this, but this Representative Luna held hearings on Capitol Hill about MKUltra, which,
Right.
this is a subject about which I had not really thought a lot. It's only sort of brave people who are willing to, look at weird, dark corners of American history who'd ever spoken to me about it, and I never really knew what to think about it. But here we are getting really credible testimony on Capitol Hill about this long-running program by the CIA that was quite extensive and involved very important players. And yet I don't think that this hearing was reported in any of the mainstream newspapers or media channels. At least I didn't feel like it really had any kind of real impact on the public mind, even as something as prominent as that.
Well, it's strange. There's a movie, since we're talking movies today, from the mid-'70s with Warren Beatty called The Parallax View, which is about a newspaper reporter who finds out about a training program run by some kind of cutout for the intelligence agencies called the Parallax Corporation. And he volunteers to enter the program to find out how it works. And it's basically MKUltra. And this movie is 75 or 76 or something like that. And he sees how they brainwash people into becoming assassins. Turns out that he's a patsy. He unbeknownst to him, he gets involved in an assassination where he's the fall guy rather than the assassin himself. But in any case, MKUltra was known to Hollywood screenwriters and to some extent to the American public back in the mid-'70s when there were first hearings on it, when it was first revealed. Why did we need them in 2026? Well, because this great forgetting that I've been talking about has taken place. We are literally being reared again as adult Americans and having to replay these moments so that we can, I think, deal with some coming consequences for things that have happened more recently. They didn't bring up MKUltra from, a program that ostensibly ended in the 70s and started in the 50s just for entertainment purposes. They're somehow preparing the ground, as they are with the JFK revelations, which were pretty in the weeds, but finally did come to some bottom line that there were more intelligence assets involved than was admitted. Because I think even though we keep thinking justice for the COVID operation and maybe for electoral fraud and so on is being endlessly postponed, maybe it's not being. Maybe an assessment of the American Innocence Project that was used to cover all these crimes, frankly, has said we've got to start these people over. They forgot. They forgot what people who watched Ace in the Hole knew in 1951. There are great cynical movies in the 50s, like A Face in the Crowd, and it's sort of like Meet John Doe, where an ordinary country bumpkin, Andy Griffith, gets turned into a populist demagogue and becomes a monster. But all the Sinclair Lewis novels were, Babbitt to Elmer Gantry were about the same thing. I mean, back in the 20s, we knew about American fraudulence deep down, and those books sold a lot. Somehow we turned into babies again.
Yeah, you're right. The 1920s merchants of death, Graft in Business. These are the titles.
Right.
Wonderful books.
Right.
Dark treatments of the Great War and who really profited from it. This was all the rage in the
But all
1920s.
those insights and all those attitudes, if you promulgate them now, are derided as MAGA, or conspiratorial, or somehow far right.
Yeah.
What's so funny is that they were actually usually promulgated by the left back when.
As long as you're going back in time, how would you classify Mark Twain in this context?
What's funny, a new biography came out of Twain last year, which tried to kind of retrofit him as a progressive hero. And
Okay.
And we've got to remember, Mark Twain wasn't his name. Mark Twain was the name of a man named Samuel Clemens, who was playing a role and quite aware of it. And he was playing the role of the American who saw through old world bullshit, basically. And as such, he appears to be a very progressive character. He was anti-imperialist. He had no time for the Spanish-American War. He had no time for American moral superiority. The idea that we were bringing, light to the dark peoples of the world and so on was something that he absolutely dismissed. But behind the scenes, he was a conservative Victorian monster. I mean, if his daughters showed up in a dress that didn't cover their, the sole of their feet, he was upset. So I don't know. Twain, like all great American characters, is powered by a great contradiction. Freedom is something that's interesting. It allows us to be mixed bags. It allows us to be complex. In totalitarian and ideologically rigid societies, you have to be one thing or another. In America, you can be two contradictory things. I think that's what it makes the country great, frankly.
Walter, thanks so much for sitting on this interview today. I had such a good time. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
I did too. Movie night.
Yeah. All the best.